Here I'm going to talk about a summary of what I covered in the longer lecture, as well as adding new notes and general recommendations and guidelines. So if you don't watch the rest of the video, hopefully this will kind of catch you up. And if you feel confused on anything, please feel free to go back and watch the more detailed explanations earlier on. So for my general guidelines when I'm approaching modeling, these are the questions I ask myself. What types of action does the model need to perform? So if the model is needing to bend and run and pick up things, then obviously it needs different types of topology and edge flow on its mesh than it does an object that's just going to be sitting in the background like a chair or a table. How close to the camera does the model get? So if we look at it really close up, then the surfaces need to be really clean and perfect, and we might even want to add more topology to get finer detail. If it's far away and we don't get a good look at it, maybe that finer detail can be just texture maps, or maybe the surfaces don't have to be as perfect. How much screen time does the model get? Is this something that is only going to be on screen for part of our film, or is this going to be something that is the main hero prop that our character wears the entire short? So these questions should determine for you how much time you spend on a particular asset and better prioritize what you're doing. Here's a collection of notes and comments I have to help students better understand modeling and their own approaches to modeling. So the first thing I would say is start with a primitive that makes sense. If I'm going to be modeling the handle of, let's say, a hammer or a screwdriver, it's probably best for me to start with something like a cylinder, right? Because it's already kind of in that shape. Maybe I'll go in and make it less dense, of course. So let's say we set it to something like 12. And we start from there. And maybe that's how I want to start with my model, right? And then I can put it into position, add new edge loops, and start tweaking its shape. And this is already kind of high poly, but this is just a demonstration. Of course, the majority of your objects, if you have any experience modeling, you'll know that cubes are really easy to work with. So even if you don't, especially if you don't have a particular primitive that matches that shape, then the cube is usually a really good start, especially if you start it really low and only add faces as you need them. So I can extrude out, and I can easily match like a silhouette or a shape from my reference. And it gets easier, it gets pretty easy to work with the cube because its topology is so evenly distributed. A sphere is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. In my opinion, I try not to use it when I can because it has different densities of topology. So you can see in the middle of my mesh, actually, let's go ahead and use more polygons. So down here, we usually have larger squares, and up here we usually have much smaller squares, and we even have triangles at these poles. So this radial topology that puckers and meets at those poles is not super friendly and easy to work with, and as we know from poles, they tend to cause distortion artifacts. But this radial topology is sometimes necessary and really helpful. So for instance, if I'm making like a character's eyeball, right, this is a really great starting point to work from because I can come in here. Let's see, I'm going to grab this, grow the selection. Let's say I'm going to actually, let's go ahead and shrink it down. I'm going to pull it back, scale it down flat, push it back a little bit more. And let's say I'm going to also grab these guys and I'll pull them back slightly more, and then I'll extrude it backwards. Right? And so you can see I'm quickly getting the shape of an eyeball, right? And it has this really, really handy ring topology that I can work around. And then I would just go in here and add some holding edges just to kind of help sharpen the shape a little bit. So there's particular uses, and especially if you don't need to worry about editing the shape, like let's say I'm going to be working on like a light bulb, like I want to model a light bulb and I don't really have to change the shape too much, then I don't, and especially if I'm not going to be animating or bending it or deforming it, then I really don't need to worry so much about that pole topology at the top, right? And it's going to shade pretty well. Let's go ahead and select this. I'll assign a new material, blend, right? You can see until you can start to see how that radial topology, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but there's a little bit of puckering caused by those triangles. So that is something that you have to contend with. Let me go ahead and I'm going to select that material. Let's see if we can make it a little bit sharper. Let's see, eccentricity. And I'm going to also add more divisions with my smooth preview. So we're going to smooth mesh, add a few more subdivisions. So you can see right here, most of the mesh, this is a pretty even shape, but when I get up to that pole, you'll start to notice it starts to break its shape a little bit. So it's not amazing, that topology that's going on up there. But like I said, if it's not something that you're particularly going to see or have to worry about with distortions, then a sphere is going to get you there really fast. One thing I would say is I would definitely never use a sphere to model something like a character's head. Right, so let's go ahead and drop this down pretty low because you'd be wanting to work pretty low. So the nice thing about a sphere is, of course, it's all rounded out, and you might have a character who has like a spherical head. But again, we have this pole at the top and this unevenly spaced sized polygons at the top versus in the middle. Instead, if you really want something that has good topologies that's going to work but is spherical in nature, what I recommend is starting with a polygon or a cube with no subdivisions on it, and then coming up to edit mesh smooth, or sorry, mesh smooth. And we can just add that many just one level of subdivisions. You can see this is pretty evenly spaced. All these squares are pretty much the exact same size, whereas these are not. And it's going to be much easier to work with this topology. And it's pretty spherical. It's not perfect, but it's going to get you there and give you nice topology to work with and extrude from. Try to capture your primary forms first before you start adding more detail. So you want to go work from broad to fine. And what this is going to do is it's going to keep your topology manageable and easy to work with, because if you start adding too much topology early on, then your mesh gets harder to work with. Here's a practical example I wanted to show. This is actually a previous student's project. I show this not to bully her or anything like that, because she actually turned out, her final model was way better than this because she went back to the drawing board and remodeled it. But this was her first go, and I thought this was a common kind of problem that students run into where you dive too soon into adding more topology and adding details before all the basic shapes are created. So you can see here, she was actually either adding too many edge loops early on, or she was just working with too many edge loops from the beginning. And so you can see here, as she's adding new edge loops throughout, as she's building her mesh, she's not taking the time, or she didn't take the time to match the shapes and the volumes before adding that topology or before adding even more. So you can see here, what she ends up with is this very square and very rectangular mesh that's kind of hard to fix that shape, right? If I want to come in here and start fixing the shape, and let's say I want to smooth these out, I'd have to maybe use a smooth sculpting brush, or maybe use soft select and start modifying the topology. But as you probably can imagine, this can take a long time, and it can be really tedious to have to do so. And sometimes, no matter how much work you do, that surface is going to just kind of remain rectangular. So you can see here, I kind of did a mock-up of how I approached this. So I started from a low poly mesh and just did basic box modeling technique of staying as low as possible to block out all the shapes I can. You can see, as also I was adding more topology, I'm taking the time to smooth out the shape. And so you can see maybe she started from a cube, and then she added more subdivisions before she started, before she fixed the original shape. And then that's what gives you this very flat and linear kind of surfaces, because, you know, even if I smooth this out, this whole area right here is pretty flat. Here I have low poly mesh, and even when I added more edges, I made sure to round this out so I got this round silhouette. So we came down over here, and I'm just keeping it as low as possible to block out those shapes. And then here's what it looks like smoothed out, right? And here's an example kind of showing me doing it the wrong way, right? So in this case, I have the same model as this one. Let's go ahead and let that one to be flat shaded. But what I did was I wanted to add more topology here so I could prepare a hole so I could attach this arm or extrude an arm out, because I knew I was going to need more topology. But the problem is when I added that topology, I didn't make sure that my curvature of my model was fixed or all my shapes were fixed. So I was going a little too fast, right? I needed to spend some time to actually block out and match the shape and curvature, make sure everything's looking good before I added more detail and kept going. And so when I extruded, you can see I got this really angular kind of juncture here because I didn't prepare that hole that I was extruding, right? I didn't make sure that that shape was looking good before I pulled this out. And because of that, when I extruded this out, I'm getting, let me go ahead and drop in a few or edge loops just to show you what that looks like when it's hard, right? So now I'm left with this very flat angular shape, not this way, because obviously I had to do that topology on purpose. You can see right here, it's this, right, this edge right here isn't matching that curvature, right? So if I wanted to actually do this, typically I'd actually model that separately, and then I would spend some time, let's see, I'm gonna take a look at this, and I'd find out that this was, for instance, 8 polygons. So I'm gonna need an area with 8 polygons on it. So what I would do is I would prepare a hole with 8 edges around it. So extrude, let me go ahead and offset that in. Okay. And I'm going to start worrying. I'm not going to get into too far into the details of doing this. Let's go transform constraint surface line. But then I would start worrying about making sure that this juncture that it's going to be attaching to is going to look nicely. And you can see I'm getting kind of these like really long stretched polygons, which honestly isn't very good. I'd probably want to do this a little bit differently, but I just want to show this for illustration's sake. Ooh. And then I'll pull this down. Okay, delete that. Take those meshes, mesh, combine, and I went ahead, and then I'll go ahead and grab these guys, grab this, and then bridge them. And I have to force a bridge, so, and then let's rebridge it. And so you can see that surface is much easier to work with because I took the time beforehand to kind of prepare that shape and make sure that shape's looking good. Like I said, don't take this as a good example because I have a lot of really long stretching polygons. I probably would have added more topology in this area. But as I'm going along and adding more topology, like I said, I want to make sure that I'm fixing the shape as much as I can as I'm going along and trying to make sure our primary forms are being supported and our mesh isn't looking kind of funky before I start worrying about even more detail, right? I want to fix what I already have. I have another example up here. And so this is something that I often see with students is here's, this is a really dumb example, but here's like a torso that someone's blocking out at the very early stages, and they want to attach a leg, okay? And here's my example on the right-hand side of kind of the same concept again. So here we have a basic box modeling kind of approach, and they're even keeping it low poly. But you can see here that this shape is still pretty square, right? This shape or this volume hasn't been rounded out to kind of have the curvature that my character might have, right? Because the torso is usually pretty cylindrical and not necessarily a square unless you're doing a robot, right? And so let's say they're not paying attention to this. Let me go ahead and make sure the settings are right. They're not paying attention to that curvature and thinking about that. I'm going to have to attach these two objects together, so I'm going to need an edge loop going that way. So I'll drop a edge loop going down that middle. I'm going to need it in the back as well. Now I'm going to grab these both. I'm going to go mesh combine, and I'm going to connect these guys. Oop. Let's go this way. Okay, and then I'm going to bridge across. And I can spend a lot of time making this look beautiful and perfect, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. But one thing I'll notice is because I didn't spend the time to actually like match that shape and get that shape how I actually wanted to before I started combining these and adding more edge loops, I'm now kind of stuck with this really flat angular shape, right? You can see it feels very angular and this feels like a square rather than like a rounded cylinder like most limbs are. And so I'd have to come in here and now I'm going to have to try to change and match this curvature, and this is going to get to be kind of a pain in the butt, right? So let's say I want to slide this in, and I'm going to take these guys and slide them in and slide it back. And you'll see after a while this is getting kind of to be really difficult to have to fix manually. Whereas over here, I have the same situation, but I spent the time at the beginning to kind of match or try to round out those shapes. So I'll go ahead and go Mesh Combine. And I'm just going to do the same concept here, where, let's see, actually, I don't think I have enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in an edge loop here. And I'm going to have to drop in an edge loop in the back. The problem is, before I go any further, I don't want to just leave those edge loops there. I want to go ahead and fix my shape before I start combining and adding more topology. So I'm going to go ahead and use something like, I'm not sure, like edge slide. Maybe I'll slide this over, just kind of give it a little bit more space. Same thing over here. I might grab these two, slide them over, this one as well, so they're a little bit more evenly distributed. I have a lot of other tools that I could show, or that I can work with. I'm just kind of doing this brute force method. Okay, and I'll check that shape, and I can see that I got a little bit of an edge here, so I can continue to fix that, but for the most part, it's pretty good. Let's go ahead and let's try to fix that. Look at this in flat shaded mode. That's because it gets pretty flat right there, and I have this extra edge in, so it's reinforcing this flat shape. So I'm going to try to reduce or fix this curvature right here, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And I'll pull this forward. Okay. All right. And now I'm going to go ahead and combine these guys together. Okay. And let's go ahead and bridge it across. And I'll grab this topology and move it forward. And scale it down. So obviously this isn't amazing, but you can see I don't really have those hard planar edges that I had on the other one. Let's go ahead and assign a new material. I don't have those hard edges and surface abrasions because I took the time to kind of evenly shape and space out my mesh before I combined them together. You want to use only as many polygons as you're going to need. This is true for modeling, like as you're going along and adding more details and you're working from rough to fine, like I just showed earlier, you want to try to match your shapes and get as best of the shape as you can with as little as you can before you start adding detail, because it makes managing and editing your mesh much easier. But on a more holistic viewpoint of your project, you don't want to add more topology than you need, because it's going to slow down your scene and it's going to make it harder for yourself and your team to work with your models. The more topology and the more polygons you have in your scene, the more it takes for your computer to compute that scene. And especially when it comes to animation and rigging, the more polygons there are, the harder it is for that person who's the rigger or the animator to do their job. So only use as many polygons as necessary and try to get away with as few as possible. Put more topology at points of articulation. If you don't have enough topology where a mesh is going to deform or bend, then you're going to end up with your shape being lost or the volume collapsing. Here's a demonstration of why it's a good idea to have more topology in an area of articulation. So we can see these are the exact same mesh. The only difference is this one has two supporting edge loops right at that point where the joint's going to be bending. So we can see how they're bending right here. And so you can see without enough topology, the mesh is going to change shape, and especially at that joint or that articulation point, it's going to lose a lot of volume. But by adding supporting edges and more topology in those spaces, we can maintain or preserve our shape through that motion. And here, let's take a look at this smoothed out. Oop, not that. Smoothed out. So you can see here, especially that even though the weight painting could be improved in this, and I could add things like blend shapes, this is a much better preservation of the shapes at that articulation point than it is over here. So you want to make sure you have enough topology in those areas where it's going to be changing shape and bending so that you're left with a good result. It's a good idea to work in pieces and then combine those pieces together afterwards. This is kind of similar to the idea of use only as many polygons as you need and block out your primary forms first before adding more topology. But the basic idea is that you want to break up your mesh into the complicated pieces and keep those pieces separate while you model them, but still keeping in mind that you're going to combine it all together. So let's take a look at an example. Here you can see I have the finished model on the left, and here's an earlier stage of the model on the right. And so the way I work is that I try to break up the piece into different components and model those different components separately and then worry about bringing them together later. What's great about this is I can really focus in and worry about a particular shape without messing up my topology in another area of my mesh. So for instance, coming in here on the arm, if I needed to add more edge loops or get a particular shape, right, I can drop in an edge loop and then modify it without, and I probably wouldn't be doing it like that. I would do it with, go ahead and look at those settings. Edge flow turned on, right? So I'll drop in that edge loop, right? Or add that topology that I need. And by doing that, I'm not adding topology through the entire mesh and then messing up my work in another area. I'll of course have to think about how this is going to eventually connect and how and prepare these areas and make them actually line up and work together. But this way, I don't have to go back and clean up these areas as I add that topology. Here's an example down here. I have the palm, which is a much lower poly object, and I have the fingers, and I would want to combine them together. But before I do that, I want to make these fingers a bit better of a shape. So I'm going to add a edge loop going down the middle of them, so I can get like a better curvature, so it's a little bit more round and it's not doesn't have this flat top to it. Oop. Now I want to start figuring out how I'm going to connect it back to the palm. So the nice thing is because these were disconnected, it was easy for me to add this edge loop in without messing up this palm shape. But I'm going to go ahead and plan out and make sure that my palm has the same topology that I need for the fingers. Okay. And then I can figure out how I'm going to connect these together. Right? And so in this case, I might combine these across like this. Let's go ahead and click bridge. Let's do these first. This one, bridge. This one, bridge. And I might do something like, let's go ahead and combine these together. And let's bridge that, add a subdivision, and then I'll just bring this subdivision backwards. Pull that up, and then I might fill it in. Anyways, I'm getting into the weeds too much. But what this does for me is it makes it so that I can easily focus on just one area of my model without having to worry about the rest of it. And I would do the same thing with this palm here, right? You can see I already started cleaning it up a little bit and I made sure I had the right number of polygons. But I could make sure this is a simple and clean shape. And then I could worry about the palm being the shape I want it to. And then the area where I'm going to connect them back together, that's where I'm kind of adding more polygons, filling in holes, and worrying about how they're actually going to physically stitch together. So this approach just makes modeling characters much easier. Here I've actually gone ahead and connected these together just to show you what I mean. So let's say for instance I wanted to drop in a new edge loop that goes right here, right? You can see because these are stitched together and I'm not working on them in separate pieces, if I need to make big structural changes or I need to make big edits in an area right here, like adding new topology, you can see this gets a little tricky because and if I want to add more edge loops, you can see those edge loops are going across the entire model, which isn't really that great. So I come in here. Now you can see, especially if I go to flat shaded mode, this is no longer evenly spaced out, and I start to have these really tightly grouped polygons. Let's go ahead and let's add a blend to my model. And we'll go across that. Now you can see they're starting to get like a weird edge and bunching and surface abrasions wherever those, you can see there's an edge right here because I'm getting these really tightly packed polygons. And it's traveling all the way up through my mesh. And so that's no good because I'm not really in control of how my topology is affecting the rest of my geometry. So in general, just again, in summation, make sure that if you're modeling different complicated pieces that are significantly different from each other, it's a good idea to disconnect them until you're ready and you're complete with that object's shape. Then you can go ahead and worry about stitching them together. Minimize poles and triangles as much as possible. So reminder, poles are vertices that have 5 edges connecting to them or 3 edges connecting them and more than 5. So anything that's not a 4-edge vertice like this one is a pole. And so you want to have those as minimized as possible on your mesh as well as triangles because they tend to cause surface distortions. So especially on curved surfaces, they start to show up as pinching and abrasions on your surface. And especially also when you deform your mesh, they will also show up and appear in sometimes nasty ways. Here's a great visualization of uh, these n-gons, or these triangles and poles, and how they're affecting curved surfaces. So you can see we're getting weird pinching and distortions because of that topology. So as soon as it leaves the quads and the vertices with 4 edges in them, you start to get into some weird distortions whenever you have a curved surface. Here's another example, right? You can notice very obviously that that pole is causing some serious distortion on a curved surface. But like I mentioned also in the longer lecture, poles are impossible to get rid of. So they're going to exist in any complex model, and the only thing you can really control is just where they are and trying to minimize how much of an impact they have on your mesh in really important areas where it's going to deform and where you have big curved surfaces that have a significant curvature to them. While you want to minimize poles and triangles, you want to completely remove n-gons. This is a point of contention between different artists, but my opinion is that, especially as you're learning and you're trying to, especially when you don't necessarily know when it's good to have n-gons and you can get away with it, and when you want to not have them, it's best to just not have them at all. So n-gons are those polygons that have more than 4 edges to them. And so the problem with n-gons is that they can cause some serious distortions to the surface of your mesh, especially whenever you turn on Smooth Preview. So you can see here, this is what it looks like flat shaded. I have all these n-gons, but they're not necessarily visually changing the appearance of the mesh, or I can't really notice them that significantly in terms of changing the shape. But once I press Smooth Preview or add a smoothing operation on it, it really messes up the surface of the shape and becomes unpredictable. And similarly speaking, whenever you actually subdivide it and you need more polygons, it doesn't really know what to do with those areas, or it behaves in a way that you can't really control or predict, and it becomes very difficult to work with. And also in general, n-gons are more likely to lead to corruptions in your model file if you're going to export it, or even when you're saving your Maya file. So they're just generally not friendly and cause so many different issues. So get rid of them as much as you can. Break them into break them into quads and triangles if you must with like a multi-cut tool. Just make sure you're identifying them and getting rid of them. Sometimes identifying your n-gons can be a little tricky, and certain tools that you use can lead to n-gons. So tools like the multi-cut tool. So if I come in here and I use my multi-cut tool, and let's say I start from here and I end right there, right? You might feel like it lets you complete the operation, but it can leave behind n-gons. So this looks like it's a quad, right? It's a pretty, it looks like clearly the 4-sided square, but when we switch over to vertex mode, we can see that there are more than 4 vertices here. And if I smooth it out, I can see that that's actually distorting, so that has 5 edges to it. Another tool that is common for creating n-gons without people really realizing it is the bevel tool. So if I select, let's say, just this edge right here, and I click on bevel, what it does is it splits that edge, and what that means is that it also splits this vertice here because it's not circling back on itself. And so because it splits that vertice, now I have a 5-sided polygon here. So I need to be careful with that as well. But the bevel tool is wherever you end your bevel, it's going to most likely cause an n-gon unless you select a polygon or an edge loop that goes all the way around. So if I select an edge loop that goes all the way around this way and click bevel, right, you'll see it goes all the way back around itself, and I'm not left. This doesn't cause any n-gons. Also notice when I'm clicking on this, if I go to vertex mode, that some vertices were left behind. And that's because I deleted some edges without realizing that it left behind my vertices. So if I go in here and let's get rid of this one. All right, so if I come in here and select this edge, and let's say I don't need this edge loop anymore and press delete, it looks good, but the problem is I can see in edge mode already, and if I switch over to vertex mode, I left behind my vertices. So I can come in here, grab them, and delete them, which gets a little tedious. My recommendation is when you're deleting your edges and you don't want the vertices to stay behind, hold Control and press delete. And what that's going to do, or Command, I think if you're on a Mac, it gets rid of both the edges and the vertices for you. To find your n-gons, what helps is just going to vertex mode. Sometimes that's enough to see. You can also turn on smooth shading. What's nice about smooth shading, let me go ahead and drop in a edge loop really, really close. Actually, I'm going to drop this edge loop and I'm going to bring it down pretty dang close to this one. Sometimes you have edges and topology that are right on top of each other, and even when I switch over to vertex mode, you can see I can't actually see that edge. So smooth preview is nice because first of all, smooth preview is going to show distortions and stretching caused by bad topology. So you can see here it's pooling in a really weird way and making the shapes look kind of funky, which is a good indication that there's something wrong with this polygon. And because even if I'm in edge mode, I can see that there's something wrong here. And also with smooth preview, if you have vertices that are like on top of each other, edges that are on top of each other, they also separate out, and I can see, oh crap, I left behind an edge here. So I'll hold Control Delete, and I'll select these guys, and I can Control Delete that to fix that edge over there, Control Delete, or I can come in here with my multi-cut tool and just cut this Ingon into 2 quads, and there we go, that looks much better. Another thing we can do is we can go ahead and use, select my mesh, I go to Mesh, Cleanup, open these tool settings. I want to select polygons that have faces with more than 4 sides. So select and faces more than 4 sides and click Apply. And I'm going to turn on Smooth Preview. Let's go ahead and click Apply. Set this. And we can see that we have an Ingon here, right? And I also have one on the other side. Let's go ahead, and I'm also going to go ahead and drop in an edge loop so we can see another example of this. And I'm going to delete that without deleting the vertices, so the vertices stay behind. And I'll select my mesh and click Apply to select it, or select matching polygons, face with more than 4 sides, click Apply. You'll see all those Ingons also highlight. So I recommend doing this. You could clean it up, but the problem is with cleanup, you don't really have a whole lot of control of how it's going to clean it up. It's going to triangulate your mesh however it feels like is best. And so it works, but it gives you just like a really nasty result. Instead, I would just use the multi-cut tool or delete and stuff, or use maybe target weld to start combining things and getting rid of them to fix those areas. Keep your quads as square as possible. This is something I don't have a really good example brought up for, but generally speaking, if your polygons, your 4-sided polygons, are more or less square in shape and size, you're going to get as little distortion on your surface as possible. Once you start getting really long or really rectangular polygons, you start to get sharper edges. And so, of course, you want to have that in certain areas, like you can see on this image of Captain America, where we want some of these sharp bevels and corners and edges. And so we want those to be essentially like longer polygons. But generally speaking, you want to keep your polygons as square as possible. If they're feeling like they're getting too stretched or they're kind of too unevenly sized, then you're going to get a lot of distortion and your shape's going to turn out looking kind of funky. Use non-destructive subdivisions. So this is kind of tied to use only as many polygons as needed. So if you can use the smooth preview function to make your mesh look better and make it look smooth, then definitely do that. You can apply a smooth modifier to your. Here I have a pretty low poly mesh. This is from the RenderMan look dev file. So it's pretty low poly, but when I use 3 on my keyboard for the smooth preview mode, it looks pretty darn smooth, right? The alternative to this would be, let's go ahead and take that. I'm going to go to Mesh, Smooth, would be actually applying the smooth modifier and the geometry to it. Let's press 1 on that one. So let's go ahead and smooth that out. You can see they look nearly identical, but this one over here on the left-hand side is going to be much easier to work with than the one on the right-hand side, and it's going to take up a lot less memory on my computer than the one on the right. So when possible, use smooth preview and in general previewing and non-destructive subdivisions to make your mesh look more complete and finished whenever possible. I recommend if you want to get a good sense of what your surface looks like and how your mesh is going to look with materials. To get a good sense of what your mesh looks like, I recommend using a Blinn or Phong material instead of the default Lambert material. The default Lambert material is missing the specular reflective component. And so it's kind of becomes really, really flat, or it looks really, really flat. A bling or a Phong is going to have that specular reflection on it, and you'll start to notice another dimension to your models, and it helps you notice any problem areas you might have. Here I have this character's torso, and this is the default Lambert material. And so it looks pretty good, but really I'm getting a lot of my surface information only from these turning edges and where I'm starting to get a shadow going on. So I'm not really seeing the actual shape of this very well compared to if I use a Blinn or Phong material. So I'll come in here, assign favorite material, Blinn. Now you can see that specular reflective component is giving me a lot more information about that shape, right? I can actually see this curvature and this shape right here, as opposed to when I had a Lambert material, right? And so I actually lose all that shape that I had right there because it's missing that specular reflection. Here I have two spheres. On the left, I don't have any poles on it. On the right, I do have a pole right here, and just generally not great topology. And so with a Lambert material, I can kind of see it, but again, I'm not really noticing it until I start to turn and look at it from like a glancing angle right there, and then I start to see it. Looking straight on, it's a little hard to see, but if I go ahead and assign my Lambert or Blinn material to it, or Phong, I can really start to notice that problem area much faster, right? So I can see that distortion much more quickly. And so, and you can see it up here as well. So with Phong or Lambert material, with that specular reflection, surface abrasions are going to become much more noticeable than with a flat Lambert. The last point I want to make in this general guidelines is welding versus keeping shapes separate. So knowing when you want to actually connect pieces together versus when you want to keep the pieces of geometry separate and make your life easier. Here I have an example of this telephone object, and I just mocked up some quick images just to show what I mean, but there's a couple instances in here where we want to think about how objects actually physically connect and making the polygons connect together between complex shapes, and when we can get away with not actually worrying about the actual mechanisms underneath what we can't see. So the first example I'm going to look at up here is this handle, the main telephone component with the earpiece and the mouthpiece. And so as we can probably see here, I'm exaggerating it in the example I'm showing in Maya, but it looks like since these are two pieces of metal that were machined separately and then welded together, that we probably want those to look like they actually physically connect. You know, if I'm looking at a weld, you know, I have this connection point, and I can worry about actually making like a rough weld texture in the texturing component, but we want that transition of where those things are actually connecting. We don't want them to look like they're penetrating each other. We want them to look like they're blending and merging together. So I see this right here where this bar meets that little earpiece, mouthpiece component. So here I am in Maya, and so I have an example on the left, right? So it was much easier to model those pieces separately, right, than model these both out of like the same exact cube and then just extrude it out. It's possible, but definitely is easier to do it this way. And on the right-hand side, we can see that I actually welded them together. It doesn't look as good as could be, of course, but actually took the time to connect this piece to that piece, right? And we see that connection point, and they look like they are made out of the same object. Here, I could try to do the same thing, right? I can come in here and let's go ahead and grab object X. Let's see if this works. Okay, probably doesn't look like it's going to work, but here I'll just grab this. We'll just worry about this side. All right, I can have it penetrate, and it does a decent job, but it clearly is like too perfect, too sharp, and it's going to have some issues with it later on when I render it. So actually physically connecting, I can kind of play with this area right here a little bit better. Let's go ahead and grab this edge right here. And I can really adjust to match that curvature into a more satisfactory shape. And I can add support edge loops. And let's go ahead and turn that on. Edge flow, close that. Just drop that in and drop this one in. And let's go ahead and grab these guys. Maybe I'll go in here and edit edge flow. We'll just try to get that to adjust a bit. Right. So I can actually play with that curvature and get that weld to feel better. So we have parts that we can visibly see. We want to reinforce and actually connect the weld where possible. It's not always possible. Sometimes the mesh is just too complicated and you're under a tight budget. But when possible, it's nice to have that connection point. Some components that would ostensibly be connected or have more geometry or more complicated structure underneath, but we can't see that structure, then we can actually not worry about actually physically connecting those components and stitching them together. So here I'm going to look at two examples, this button here and this rubber piece on the earpiece. So we're going to come over to mine. So here I have the same object and I just cut off a part of it down here. So on the left-hand side, you can see I've actually connected those pieces together. And this is a really simple example, but in a lot of cases, this is unnecessary because this bottom piece right here is supposed to be a separate, would in real life be like a separate piece that's on top of the original mesh. So if you ever have objects that in real life aren't going to be connected together, then do not connect them together as much as possible. There's certain situations where you can get away with it, but the general rule of thumb is it's just going to make it harder for you to work with materials and to make those models work together. You have to like start worrying about how they actually physically connect together. So one of the problems here is if I wanted to make this feel like this is a rubber covering on top, you'll see here this crease isn't really enough, right? I can clearly see if I get close enough that this piece right here is welded to this piece right here. I can come in here and I can, start modifying and extruding and doing some more work and just kind of like doing something like that, right? I could do that to get away with it. Now I'm left with a different problem though. If I want to apply materials, like let's say I want to apply a bronze material up here and a rubber material down here, then I would have to actually assign materials by faces instead of by object, and that gets a little tedious. Over here, I have the top part, which it stops right there, and then I have the bottom part, which stops right here. And like I said, this is kind of a simplified example, but in general, this makes it a lot easier for me to manipulate and select objects, right? So I can select that rubber piece and the metal piece separately, assign different materials to them. You can even see this one has different topology. It doesn't really need it right now, but let's say I wanted to plug in some holes down here and I needed more edge loops going through, so I smoothed it out. And this piece right here, I don't really need that, so I kept it smooth. But because they're disconnected, I don't actually have to worry how they're going to connect back together. Say in this example over here, if I wanted to add more topology in here, I could use, I could smooth it out, or I could use like the multi-cut tool. But you'll see, because I'm doing that, I'm actually having to worry about adding topology through the rest of my mesh, which is, not ideal, right? So it's adding edge loops throughout my entire mesh when I don't really need them in those other areas. So that also adds an added benefit. So if those objects aren't going to be physically connected, keep them separate because it's going to make it a lot easier to model. Here's an example of that top of the chest, and so I just did this super fast. But we have in this case like you would think that there would be a hole for this button to go in, and there'd be like a mechanism underneath that maybe it unlocks or activates something inside of the telephone. But in this case, because it has this metal covering that is covering that hole, I don't need to worry about that hole so much, right? Because we're never really going to see that little inside area too well, especially once it's lit. So that's a situation where, it would be overkill and unnecessary for me to have to model in that hole down there. And you even see, again, because this is let me bring up the image. Since these are different objects, right? So this metal piece and this button and this wooden body are different pieces, I'm not going to try to physically connect them because it doesn't make sense for them to be connected. And we have one other example here that I wanted to show, again, of this same idea of having a hole and when to show the hole. So here we have a screw in a screw hole, and let's say we're going to get really close to this object, so we need this detail. Generally speaking, you don't need this, you don't need this level of detail on objects unless you're getting really close up. But you can see here I actually had to model in a hole because I wanted the screw to be, maybe I wanted to animate it screwing in, so it has to start with a hole, or maybe I want it to be partially extruded out. This one over here, let's say this is fully screwed in. Let's go ahead and set that to center pivot. So let's say this is fully screwed in, right? And it's going to be kind of feeling like it's flush with the mesh, right? There is very little to no chance I'm going to look down there and be like, oh my God, there's no hole. And this object also has an added benefit of, that it has this overhang head to it too as well. So the overhang of this head is kind of blocking most of the time that actual, where that connection between the object or the penetration between the screw and the block is. And so I don't, again, I'm not really going to have to worry about actually modeling in that hole to make sense. And I can just let it penetrate because I'm not going to visually see that penetration. So in general, you want to keep in mind that objects that penetrate each other, they start to look fake and CG. So when possible, if your objects are actually supposed to be welded together in real life and physically connected, and you will see that in your 3D view, then you want to go ahead and connect them if possible. If those objects are supposed to be separate, and like in real life they would be actual separate objects, it's generally a good idea to actually model them separately and keep them disconnected because it makes creating the models much easier, right? Because if I modify this model, it's not going to modify it. I don't have to worry about hurting this one and cleaning this one up later. It also makes materials easier to do later down the line. Anytime that you're going to actually see like the understructure or you need to see the inner workings, then it's a good idea that you need to model it. So in this case, this hole right here that the screw is going into, it helps for me to see it. But if it's not going to be seen, then you can get away with penetrating objects, right? So penetrating objects makes things look like they're CG and fake, but if I come over here, I don't have to worry about that because I'm not going to see that junction area, so I can let them penetrate and make my life easier. Guidelines for modeling for animation and characters. The characters typically need to move and bend and deform in particular ways. So when you're modeling for characters, it's important to pay a lot of attention to your edge flow because even though your model might look good in its neutral or default pose, you'll have different movements and maybe even different expressions that the geometry needs to support in order to hit, right? So whenever that body, so guidelines for making, so guidelines for modeling for animation and characters, you want to really be focusing on topology. And so this isn't just so that your shapes look good in its neutral pose, but you have to consider how your model is going to have to perform and bend and deform and change shape, and also how they might have to do facial expressions, right? And so that topology is needed to support that pose that they're going to hit and the volumes and shapes they're going to make. So you can see in this example with Moana, when she makes this smile, we want that little kind of smile crease and that kind of bulging out of the cheek fat right there when she smiles. And so that topology needs to support that. One of the easiest ways to think of topology for animation is that edge loops should run perpendicular and parallel to the direction of deformation. So the example I used previous is thinking of limbs particularly as a bendy straw or an accordion. And so you have these ridges or these lines that go perpendicular to the angle that it's going to be rotating or bending at. So if I come to the next slide here, you can see this guy bending over at the waist, right? His topology is going perpendicular and parallel with the direction that he's going to be bending that limb. Same thing with like the limbs or the knees and the ankles. And here's another example where those fingers are bending, that the topology is parallel and perpendicular with that joint. If you have a face that needs to express in an anthropomorphic way, there's kind of codified methods of laying out topology to match certain muscle groups and facial actions. So if you are in this situation where you need to do that, I would recommend looking at guidelines just to kind of get a sense of how other people have structured it because it is a little complex and you don't know until you get some experience how the face is going to deform and how it's going to be creating new shapes. So these are great guidelines out there for these muscle groups and topology lines to help you support matching these actions based on anatomy. And here's another example, similar to that Moana one, where you can see how this guy's topology is really supporting some of these shapes, like particularly this cheek line is one that I like to point out a lot, is that topology really follows those shapes that he's trying to get to. So having that proper edge flow that goes around his mouth from his nose down to around his chin, again, is really helping him in this situation as this artist creates these facial expressions. And here's just one more example I want to show. Again, a lot of attention was paid to the edge flow and the direction of these edge loops and which directions they go. And again, it's based on those muscle actions that the face needs to do when it expresses. And so there's just like a great standardization to this kind of method that I recommend you guys take a look at and do some research for, because a lot of artists have figured this out before us and made this process a bit simpler than it would be if we were just doing this blindly from scratch. So a summary, we want our edge loops aligned to support both contours and shapes and to give us the best deformations. You want to work with fairly low to medium poly count because your character is going to be animating and moving, and if the animator and the rigger want to be playing around with your model, they don't want something that's super heavy and dense because it's going to slow down their machines and slow down their workflow. You want to keep it almost all quads, primarily for subdivision, but also just for appearance of surfaces. But this is going to make it easy for you to do subdiv preview. You want poles to be in flat or non-deforming areas. So here's a pole right here. You can see pretty clearly this 5-sided vertice. And so you want those to be in areas that are going to be relatively flat and aren't going to change or bend shape too much. So it'd be a bad idea to put it down at the corner of her cheek, right? Or corner of her mouth, because that area changes shape a lot. But right here, it stays, even though it moves around a little bit, it stays relatively safe and isn't going to be changing shape too much. And also, this is a basic rule of thumb, is you want to make sure that you're modeling your characters in as neutral a pose as possible for the rigging artists, because that it makes it a lot easier to go from neutral into a pose rather than making your character modeled in a pose and then going to neutral. Here's some examples of popular neutral poses for bipedal characters. And so that's the T pose and the A pose. So a T pose is literally this, you have your legs straight up and down and your arms straight out to the side, kind of like a cross, right? And then the A pose would be something similar, but you're going to have the arms down lower at a kind of a 45-degree angle from the shoulder to the hips. The purpose of them, which one to use, is really based on what sort of deformations or actions you think your character is going to make. So if your character is going to be reaching above their head a lot, T-pose is great because you're going to be kind of in the middle between your range of motion, right? So going from down to the hips, like the hands down here to the hands up here, this is kind of right in the middle. And then at A pose, if you don't think your character is going to be like lifting their arms above their head like super high, then it's probably better to do this because you're going to get a better shape in the shoulders, and it's going to feel a little bit more natural when you model that neutral pose in. Generally speaking, for other neutral positions, it's always a good idea to do some research to find some reference, but usually for objects like a tail or even like a scarf, right, you want to keep those as straight as possible and then let the animator get it into a more natural pose, like, a tail dangling or the scarf kind of draping down the character's from the character's neck. So if you as the modeler are trying to get those poses in the actual model, it's hard to go to anything else besides that neutral position. Neutral positions and just keeping things straight and flat and even and relaxed is going to make it easy to go between different dynamic poses in the rigging stage and the animating stage. But if you model in a pose, you're going to run into some really difficult moments. This is also for faces. You might want to model your character with their eyes wide open and their mouth closed, but in some cases, I would recommend actually keeping the eyes kind of at their halfway point, so halfway closed and the mouth partially open. This has two benefits. One, it's going to help with texturing because the texturing artist is going to have more surface area to work with, like they can get inside the mouth and the lips, they can get on the eyelids. Whereas if it was fully open or fully closed, then they didn't have access to those. And also, again, similar to those limbs and the tail, that keeping them in like kind of a neutral midway point or relaxed state is going to make going from between extremes much simpler. So going from this halfway close option up to open and then down to closed is much easier than if you start fully open and try to go down to closed. You have a lot more that the rigger and the animator is going to have to clean up. So talk amongst your team to figure out if you guys need to worry about this so much. But if you're doing like a facial rig or something like that, there's kind of also a neutral pose for that as well. And just to reiterate, you don't really want to model your character with like an expression, so you don't want them to necessarily be sad, unless they're going to be sad the entire short, right? If they're going to have like worried eyebrows the entire short, sure, go ahead and model it in. But if your character is going to be having different expressions, try to keep it as flat and plain and neutral as possible. This applies to both hard surface and soft surface or organic objects. But sometimes it's a really good idea to actually plot out your topology. So I frequently do this myself with organic characters, especially with faces, and then also with really complex objects that I know I'm going to have a difficult time with. And that's kind of taking your asset or your reference or your concept art into a painting or drawing program and then drawing out what you think the topology is going to look like. This kind of acts as just making a rough draft. I mean, ignore the topology a little bit here because it's not great. This is kind of like creating a rough draft of your work and planning ahead before you get down into the weeds and have to worry about, if you spend too much time modeling the nose and you haven't thought about how it's going to connect to the mouth, you can spend a lot of time having to do a lot of cleanup work. So doing something like this ahead of time can save you a lot of time in the future and make plotting out topology simple. Because as anybody who's modeled before knows that topology can be really, really challenging and edge flow can be really, really challenging and feel like a puzzle or a math problem in some cases where you're staring at it and trying to figure out how the heck am I supposed to fix this, right? So having this kind of planned out beforehand is going to uh, give you an advantage and make it a lot simpler just to kind of follow your own guidelines. I'm not going to go into the specifics of hard surface and environment modeling. I think those are more detailed instructions on just how to model in general, because they don't really have the same specifications or requirements that characters in animation have. In general, though, we can be a little bit more flexible and free with how we plan out our topology if our model doesn't have to deform. So you don't really have to care so much about how how your topology lays for deformation, and you really should just be focused on putting in topology to capture the shapes and forms and making sure that your surface is going to render and light nicely. Here's one thing I did want to cover for just another example of common pitfalls for hard surface modeling. So here I have the exact same mesh, but set up slightly different in both cases. So on the right-hand side, you'll notice right here we're getting a bit of some pinching on these curved surfaces, and that's because when we turn on smooth preview, this surface is going to start curving and bending, right? And so you can see that bend or that pinch going on right there because of some topology that we'll take a look at. And over here, we're not getting that result, even though these are very close to being the same mesh, right? This has its own difficulties that could be cleaned up, but that area particularly is currently fixed. And so the difference between these two meshes, let's go back to flat shaded mode, is that I've mentioned this before, but you want to avoid placing triangles and n-gons on areas that are going to be a curved surface. So you can see in this corner, when I smooth it out, that's going to be a curved surface, right? And so because I needed to add the supporting edges here, and I didn't want to add edges all the way through, I had to create a pole at some point to kind of collapse it from one edge into three edges. But obviously the issue here, and let's actually go ahead and delete this and see if how much that shouldn't drastically change anything, but changes a little bit, it looks like. But we're still getting that pinching going on right there when I get rid of that edge. But anyways, so the issue is I have that pole that is going to cause pinching on curved surfaces. Over here, I have the same setup, but I actually have that pole resolving itself on the flat part. So I turn on this on, you'll see that that pole is actually on the flat part of the mesh and not on the curved part. And so that's why we don't get that, that pinching or that surface abrasion. So in general, my recommendation is if you're going to have poles or you need to resolve or redirect topology and do something funky, it's best if you can do that on a flat surface rather than on a curved surface because you won't end up with these severe pinching artifacts that you get on that example over there. Sometimes you do end up in this situation though, and it gets hard, right? Because over here, if I wanted to add a supporting edge loop in this space, because I have this radial topology already going in this direction, let's go in this direction, right? I have this radial topology going in this direction. It's easy for me to drop in a new edge loop that circles around that without going through my entire mesh, and that lets me kind of offset and push away those bad areas away from the edges. right? Over here, you can see I've already put myself into a situation where those bad vertices and bad edges are right along that curved surface, and I can't really add a new edge loop going all the way through here very easily without having to do like a lot of cutting and a lot of welding. One trick I'd like to show you guys and kind of not focus too much on, but just a little quick tip is using the bevel tool. So I'm going to grab those edge loop that goes all the way around and click on the bevel tool. And then I'm going to turn off chamfering. And so what that's going to do is it's going to keep my hard edge, right? And it's going to put two edges on either side, or two edge loops on either side supporting that edge. I'm going to get rid of this bottom one because that's not the one I need. I just need this one right here. And so now I'm going to select this edge that I just created. It's not my outer holding edge. And you'll see now I put myself a little bit of a gap and I'm pushing this bad pole away from the curved surface, kind of like I have it over here. And so what I can do is I can come here and do slide edge, or in the modeling toolkit, transform for edge slide. And then I can just drag this away, and there we go. We have that same situation we have over here where we've pushed that edge or those poles away from that curved surfaces. So this is a nice way of, again, beveling can cause some problems if you don't use it right, but it can give you a little bit of wiggle room to push things away from the areas that you don't want them to be at. Here's just one more demonstration I'm going to show of that same technique. So I use the multi-cut tool to cut in this number 1 into this squarish surface. And I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to how this is looking right now. And it actually does have radial topology going around it. So if I add a new edge loop, it goes all around it. Let's pretend it didn't. So if I needed to have my shape here, but it doesn't have that supporting topology around it, right? And I need that little extra support that goes around it. So if I was in that situation, what I would do is I'd select that cut that I made, and then again, I would use that bevel tool, and I would turn chamfering off, and that preserves that that original middle line. You see that original middle line is going to be that original shape that I have, and the two edges that are on the outside of it are going to be my supporting edges. So I can come in here, maybe I'll give that a little bit of extra space, and maybe I'll come in here. Now I can delete this stuff right here maybe. But that gives me a really quick radial topology that circles around whatever my selection was. And then I can freely add in new edge loops to give it extra support. So if you're ever in a situation where you don't have radial topology around an area that you kind of need that, so you can get that extra edge support, and so you can kind of control some of your poles and triangles a little bit better, using that bevel trick can be kind of handy. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about is cleaning up your files. So these are general suggestions that you guys really need to follow to make your models work within your pipeline, especially for your own sake, but also for your team's sake, because other people are going to be using your models later on. If you don't clean them up, you're just making everybody else's life harder. Okay, so the first thing I would say is make sure you center your object in your scene and then set its pivot point to be aligned with the origin. Here I have a character who's not currently in the center of the scene. And so when I export this and I'm done with my model and I send it off to maybe texturing or rigging or even layout when they place the characters and the assets into the environment, it's going to be a little frustrating because they're going to have to do some cleanup work to get my character in a predictable spot. So I want to do this in the modeling phase once I'm done with my model and I'm sending it off. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the character's pivot point, which is right here, to be lined up with the center of their body, or where their essentially their axis of symmetry is. In my case with this character, it goes all the way through. Their axis of symmetry, like on a human, would be going through the middle point between the left side and the right side. It's not true for all objects and all characters, but generally speaking, it's going to be in that middle of that character, in the splitting the x-axis left and right. Okay, so I'm going to select my objects, and I'm going to go ahead and go to Edit Pivot Point. So I'm going to open my tool settings, click on Edit Pivot, and then I'm also going to click the Snap to Vertex mode. And so what I'm going to do is I just need to snap this to any vertice that's lined up with the middle of my character in that middle symmetry line. Okay, so now I've done that. That's great. Okay, now I'm going to go back and turn off Edit Pivot Point. So Tool Settings, turn that off. Okay, now I'm going to turn on Snap to Grid. And what I'm going to do is I want my character to be more or less centered or standing in this plane or in this or near this origin point. So what I definitely want them to do is I definitely want them to be their mirror of symmetry to line up with this z-axis. So I want them to kind of be evenly straddling this plane, and that might sound kind of confusing. I hope it doesn't, but essentially I want it to my character to line up right here with this middle line. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna, with that snap to grid turned on, I'm gonna bring them over, and I might do this from above to make sure that they have my center line right there, and then I have my pivot point for my character right here. I'm just gonna drag them back as well. So this part's not as necessary, but this pivot point doesn't have to also go right in the origin. It also doesn't have to necessarily go across center on this axis right here, but it's good to kind of keep them pretty dang close to the origin. I don't want my character's geometry to be down through the floor like this. Like I don't want to actually move it right here, right? So not every character should be actually centered, like their center of gravity or center of mass should be in the origin, because that kind of gets annoying too, because you have to like pull the character up out of the ground. So I usually just like have my character sit on the ground or have my object sit on top of the ground, and that makes it a little bit easier, right? And then the last step I need to do is I'm going to move my pivot point down to the center of my scene. And so this is going to make it predictable when I export this file, import to another one, that the character is going to end up in the exact same spot that I put it right here. If I don't do this and I import it, my character will come in like this. Or if my pivot point was out further forward, right, then they would come in like this or something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit my pivot point again. So open tool settings, edit pivot point, and then I'm going to turn on snap to grid, and I'm just going to drag that right onto my uh, the origin of my scene. And then I'll come back to object mode, and there we go. So now we have a centered character in my scene, and the pivot point is in the origin. Next, I want to go ahead and freeze my transformations on my geometry. So we can see in here that my model has translation and scale values that are non-standard or non-zeroed out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select my mesh. I'm going to go to Modify, Freeze Transformations. And what that'll do is it'll set this as my character's neutral or zeroed out state, right? Otherwise, if I was the rigger and I wanted to kind of zero this out, or I accidentally move the character and I need to bring it back to where it was before without doing something complicated, I'd have to come in here and type in 0 and come in here and type in 1. And you can see that is not where the character originally was, and so that's an issue. This is essentially when you freeze your transformations, you're setting your character's neutral or default position. So if anybody ever, like if I move this, rotate the character, and then scale it, right? If I ever need to undo that and go back to its neutral position, I can come in here and type in 0 for the translate and rotates, and then come in here and type in 1 for the scale. So make sure you freeze your transformations to make that easier for other people. We want to delete our history for our modeling assets. This is really important because especially between Maya versions and even just saving your file and opening it again, modeling history can cause a lot of complications in terms of corruption and inconsistencies with what the model was saved as and what it was opened as. So if I save my model and has a bunch of modeling history, there's a chance I might open it and there's some kind of corruption in that history that causes my mesh to completely be destroyed. So you want to delete your history pretty frequently, but especially when you want to pass it on to someone else. You can see here I have a little bit of history on my object. If I go to the channel box under inputs, if we have anything down here, then we can see that we have these poly operations or these modeling operations. I can also find an attribute editor. So I have my default object node, my default shape node, and then I have these other nodes that are those modeling things. And this one doesn't have super long history, but you've probably seen like really, really long history on your object. So what I can do to get rid of those and lock in my model and get rid of that history is go to Edit, Delete by Type, History. And you'll see it cleans up my attribute editor significantly, and those entries are no longer visible underneath the inputs. There's not even an inputs tab anymore. Sometimes you don't want to delete all your history though, especially when you're in the rigging stage. So you can see here I have some modeling stuff like poly extrude face and tweak, but I also have a skin cluster, which is my rigging skinning, and then I have a blend shape, which is a deformer where my model moves from one position to another position. I go in here and go edit delete by type history, then what that does is it actually gets rid of all that rigging stuff. So now my mesh is no longer bound to my skeleton and I can't actually move the skin anymore and I have to redo it. So if you're in that situation, what you want to do is select your mesh and go edit delete by type non-deformer history. And you'll see, once it does this, it got rid of that extrusion that I had, or that polymodeling operation that I had, and left behind the rigging and the blend shape. So if you're in that situation where you have some history on your model, but you also have some history you want to keep, but you want to get rid of some of it, then you want to go ahead and do edit delete by type non-deformer history. Make sure you name your objects something descriptive and useful. So I like to use a name, something like this, where I have something like shirt for like a shirt object, an eyeball, something that when you read it at a glance, you know which object it's describing. And then I usually have letters that describe what type of object it is and maybe what side of the object or what side of the model it is if there's like duplicates or symmetry going on. So often I'll use like geo for geometry or polygon objects. So shirt underscore geo would be the shirt geometry. CTRL maybe for control or JNT for joint. Let's see, I have two eyeballs, so I'll have a right eyeball and a left eyeball. So I'll use underscore R and underscore L to signify right and left. And then I have something like maybe a group name, so like my character group. And so this makes it easy. One, it makes it easy at a glance to know what you're looking at, but two, it also gives you some advantages of selecting objects by names, or if you're going to be doing some kind of scripting, you can easily select everything that has a geo tag to it or a control tag to it, so you can do more complex operations for those. This depends on your workflow, but I like to usually put my object into a group. And the reason why I like to do that is it's generally a good idea to keep, if you're going to be placing your object into a scene later on, so let's say I modeled a lamp and I'm going to put it into an environment, it's best not to actually put transform values on the object itself, but on like a container that's holding the object. So generally speaking, I usually put my objects into a group just to kind of clean it up. But it really depends on your team's workflow. And as always, make sure you guys make backups and increment save your files so that if anything goes wrong or you make a tweak and you make an update, but that update messed something else up, you could always go back. So make sure you make backups and document your files and increment save. And just for those people who aren't familiar with increment save, you can go into File, Increment and Save, or Control Alt S, and that's going to give you a number like this, modeling examples 0.0001.ma. It's going to give you like a version numbering automatically, and it's just going to speed up your workflow instead of having to go out and rename your models. So when you do this, this is kind of a good preview of what it looks like when you don't clean up your file, right? We have all these bad transform values. We have a lot of history on our models that can get kind of complicated and prone to corruption. We have a bunch of unknowable objects inside of our outliner, right? And then this is something that's more cleaned up. This might not be my naming convention that I would use, but whatever works for your team and makes sense to you, you can totally use it. But here we have frozen transform values and a cleaned up history.